Just really quick,
Yeah.
the reason why they're important is once you know what type of relation you're standing in towards the technology, it will tell you what kind of desires that technology is going to give you. So it will help you figure out how it's influencing you.
Okay, everyone, welcome again to the Kirkwood Center podcast for Theology and Ethics. My name is Anthony Costello. I am the president of the Kirkwood Center, last time I checked at least. And today I'm joined by Dr. Jim Johansen, who's above me on the screen, as far as I can tell, and Dr. Emily Stevens. Now, if you have medical issues, Jim and Emily are not necessarily the types of doctors that you would run to. But both of them have backgrounds in philosophy and science. And today we're going to take specifically a look at the nature of technology. Emily Stevens has written her dissertation at the University of Aberdeen. Emily, that's right, Aberdeen, not Andrews, right?
Yes, my hoodie says so.
There it is. Proof. That's not
Proof.
AI. That's not AI generated sweatshirt, ladies and gentlemen.
Uncontrovertible
That's
proof.
an actual sweatshirt.
Yeah.
Um, well, Emily, I'm going to let you introduce this topic. It is on technology. It's on the nature of technology, even more specifically, what we're going to talk about today, which I think is very relevant to everybody. But, we got to get some theological language, to grasp what's going on here, is how technology affects us, the user, in some very specific ways, But why don't you first give us, before we get into this particular aspect of your dissertation, of your PhD work, give us an overview of what the dissertation was on in general, more generally.
Yeah, so the dissertation itself was actually a critique of bioethics, specifically in relation to enhancement technologies, which we've done a recording on already with the enhancement technologies and bioethics. But yeah, so I roughly went through a lit review of the bioethics discourses and discussed how they're all a little bit deficient, and then moved on to philosophy of technology, hoping that that would help solve some of the shortcomings that I was seeing within the discourse. And I moved specifically to the work of Don Ihde. So he worked at SUNY, so New York University, for quite a while. And yeah, he's one of the top three original, at least this is his claim, and he does say this in his book. He is one of the top three philosophers of technology within the US. So he names himself, Langdon Winner, and Albert Borgman as the top three. And so, yeah, so I just found his work to be really interesting and actually a little bit deficient in some areas, which is why I decided to use his work, because I could actually see where I could sort of distance myself and clarify some things that I thought might be problematic within his work itself. So, so yeah, I used his notions of technology to sort of sharpen the bioethics discourse, and I ran his sort of understanding of techno systems and techno fantasies and that sort of a thing through Charles Taylor's notion of enchantment, and just sort of saw what happened. So I sort of matched him up with Charles Taylor and saw some interesting fruit come of that. So yeah, roughly that's the dissertation. And then I pulled it all back around to say, well, if we change our understanding of technology and how it's neutral, which he thinks it's not. If you think technology is not neutral, then that changes the sorts of conversations you'd have in bioethics, specifically in relation to enhancement technologies. So that's roughly what the dissertation was. Yeah, so
before we're going to get into this section of your dissertation, which starts with whether or not technology is neutral. and we're going to define neutrality versus non-neutrality and what that means with regards to the technologies that human beings develop. Just out of curiosity, though, so you said Ihde, how are we saying his name again? Ihde or Ihde?
Heidi.
Ihde. Don
Yeah.
Ihde.
Yes.
And you said that self-proclaimed is one of the three. Is he still alive?
Yes.
He's
Last time I checked.
contemporary.
Yeah.
Okay. And is he still active at University of New York?
He's retired now.
Okay, so he's older.
Yeah.
All right, because he's not a name. I mean, I read a reasonable amount of philosophy, not a lot of contemporary stuff, but he's not a name that is super well known, I think, right?
Well, within philosophy of technology, he is.
Right, but maybe and I don't know how, I mean, I'm sure that's probably a growing area, I'm sure, in philosophy. But he's not associated with just one of the more general branches of philosophy, a metaphysician or an epistemologist or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he's very he's very specialized in this area, along with maybe a couple others, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's not is he a religious person in any sense, or do you know, or is that totally irrelevant?
I don't think he is based on the stuff that I found, but I do know he has an MDiv because there was one introductory part of his one of his books. I can't remember which one it was, but he did mention he got an MDiv, and I can't remember where he got it from, but I know he does have an MDiv. So he does have religious language, which is why one of the reasons why I found him so intriguing, because has religious language. He understands what religion is, but he doesn't necessarily have that, like, again, that I know of. He doesn't have a tradition that he holds to, but I could be wrong about that because he hasn't come out and said very strongly either way.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. All right. So, okay, let's get into this section then on the define for us what is meant when we talk about technology being neutral or its antithesis, its opposite, non-neutral. What is Ihde talking about here?
Yeah, so the idea of neutrality within this context would just be technology is like a piece of something out there, just like an object that you sort of use however you want, and you look at how you're applying it to see whether it's something that should be invented or not, or whether you should use it or not, or something like that. So like which end you're using it for is what's important with the neutral, and you get to decide that, right? So like you get to have some sort of control over the object itself when you consider it to be neutral. Non-neutrality is more like there's a causal link between the technology and you, and the technology is kind of interacting with you when you interact with it and changing your perceptions and even the world around you. So, I mean, an example of how a technology could change the world is just if you look at how American cities are built versus European cities. European cities were built prior to cars, right? So they're just not built the same way as an American city, at least past the East Coast, right? So like older cities like Boston or something might have areas where they're more friendly to pedestrians, but roughly speaking, you think of American cities or, the American countryside, you have to have a car. It's impractical to not have one because everything, or a lot of the structures were built after cars were invented. So, yeah.
So it'd be the technological object, the car, or the automated vehicle, or whatever these, the
automobile, the
horseless carriage, right?
Yeah.
Determining what kind of cities we build. And then the types of cities we have built, and they're built that way because of this prior piece of technology, then they have this effect on the people on the inhabitants of those cities, right?
Yeah. And another piece of it would be it changes your perception of space because you can now live further away from things that you would have normally had to walk to. Okay. So it sort of shrinks space, whereas before it was larger and you had to live closer to things because you wanted to get to them because you didn't have a car, right? That could go like 60 miles an hour. So you can go 3 miles in a matter of 2 minutes or whatever the math is. I'm not a mathematician, right? But like you
Yeah.
see what I'm saying? Like it
No,
changes
yeah.
the perception of space itself. So
So
yeah.
the technological object, the artifact, is then, according to Ihde, and others, I'm assuming, not neutral in virtue of it um, affecting us in a way that we have no sort of control over, right? How it
Right.
affects.
Yeah, it influence. So another way to say it is the technology uses the user. So it just sort of reciprocally influences you while you're using it. And then you can sort of change the way that you're using it, but it still is influencing you as you use it.
Okay.
And again, changing the world around you.
And is that something that says generally the case with any piece of technology is that way? I mean, does he make that a kind of universal claim? Like anytime we make something that we would, I guess, consider a piece of technology, it has that property of non-neutrality.
Yeah. Yeah, he would say any piece of technology is non-neutral.
Okay. Now, are there others who say that the opposite? I mean, what's the counter to that? That no, technology is neutral. I mean, um, there's got to be people I assume hold that view as well, correct?
Well, within philosophy of technology, there's only one. Martin Frossen, I think is how you say his last name. He's the only one I've encountered that doesn't think that.
Okay,
So
so
yeah, it's
there's
roughly a consensus.
roughly consensus that as soon as we make a piece of technology, the technology has a non-neutral sort of
Yeah,
property or status.
yeah,
Okay. Which scares me, given the technologies that we're making, Emily.
Well, I
yeah,
would
same.
argue that technology, the people that develop technology, that's exactly what they want to have happen. They're trying to
Mhm.
say improve people's lives. I know there's a lot of things that you discuss in your dissertation, but maybe just a general theme that I would observe. I mean, I was thinking like I've been to you mentioned Europe, and so one of the things that they did as an enabler was a train station. So just as long as you live near a train station that you can go to the downtown and you can live in this more remote area. That's an example of I think a beneficial way of how technology is actually um, um, helping out lives. But I know you talk about a lot of different ways of how we encounter and the kind of things that go on with technology and what you wrote.
Yeah, and it's helpful to note that and now this is my distinction and not his, is I do think that there's a difference between a tool and technology. I'm still
Yeah.
working on like that's a research interest of mine where I think there is a distinction between the two.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I think a train is obviously an example of a technology, um, but yeah, I think that there is a distinction to be made in there, and I'm not sure
Mhm.
how to figure it out and find the distinctions or the nuance, but it's something,
Mhm.
like I said, it's a research interest. It's something I'm going to be working on. So
Well, let's carry on then with because in the section that we're going through here on the non-neutrality of technology, you lay out, or Ihde lays out, and you sort of recapitulate here for the reader, four features of non-neutrality. So walk us through these four features, and what are their significance then in understanding how technology is not neutral.
yeah, so roughly it would be like what he calls a techno system. So that's like the sort of cultural milieu that you live within is technologically textured, is how he'd say it. So it sort of kind of gives a rough trajectory of how life is going to be within it. So it kind of colors everything around it. Um, and the way that he would say it is it's all encompassing, but it's not totalizing. So he's really careful to say, Ilol is wrong. Like he's very much like Ilol's wrong. It's not in a totalizing aspect of your life. So you can have some level of control.
That
Whereas
that
for
you that you reference, is that Jacques Ellul that you referenced?
yeah, Jacques
Yeah.
Ellul. Yeah. So
He wrote a book called what was it, Technology in the Technological Society?
yeah, the Technological Society, and there was another one that Do I have?
Well, I think you also
Yeah,
mentioned.
the Technological Society is one of them. That's the one I have. I know there's two of them, and I can't remember what it might be the Techno System.
Okay, so Lowell was arguing that the technological system is totalizing.
Yeah, so like it's the dominant aspect of your life, and there's no way for you to control it. It just controls everything.
Okay,
Is
so
what?
Ihde doesn't
Yeah.
think that it's that bad.
No, he doesn't. He thinks that you can get into the what he calls the trajectory and sort of nudge it different directions and try to give it better or worse or better outcomes than what it might have had otherwise. So he doesn't want to say that you are completely controlled by technology, where it feels like sometimes that is what Alol's opinion is. And again, I'm not really very well versed in Alol. I've only read a couple books of his, so yeah, I wouldn't claim to be like a little scholar or anything like that, Um, yeah.
Well, I've read a couple books on of his, and they're great, but they weren't his works on technology per se. But
Yeah.
Aside from The Meaning of the City, which does certainly touch on that.
Yeah.
But so idea is saying, so what's the example? Is there an example of the techno system, or is the techno system just kind of everything?
It's just kind of everything. It's kind
It's
of
kind
all
of
over the place.
everything, the
Yeah.
world we live in with all the technologies that are presented to us.
Yeah, it's just a technologically textured life world is how he'd
Okay.
say it.
All
Yeah.
right. And so what idea is saying is we have some freedom. There's sort of some still freedom for us to live in the world, but live in that technologically layered world, but not be entirely determined by it or controlled by it.
Right. Yeah. Determines exactly the right word.
Okay.
So
I
yeah,
mean, there's a lot in this section where I'm like, you know, it made me think of like our relationship with God, but like replace God with technology. Because
that's
it's
a
like
whole
how
other
much,
conversation.
yeah, it reads, it's an inch because you think of like how much, you got different views of how participatory are we in our relationship with God. Does God, you got the hyper Calvinistic kind of maybe a more God who
Yeah.
determines everything, and then you got more Armenian strains of thought where human freedom is more open. But so as I was reading this, I'm
Yeah.
thinking of the whole sort of Calvinist Armenian kind of historical debate in theology, right? But it was okay. It's interesting. So the techno system is the world of the technological world we live in, and Ihde, as opposed to Elul, is saying that we can live in it, and we have some agency, I guess.
Yeah.
Kind of you move the system a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I mean. That's what he'd want to say. Yeah. Like that you have some level of agency and you're not determined by the technology, even though you can't control it really.
Okay.
It's interesting. Even at this last Sunday on church, they had some folks that have a retreat center over at Catalina Island. And one of the things that we're advertising is the idea of getting away from your technology. So your cell phone's not going to work and all these other things. So maybe that's what I'm hearing you say. And maybe it's useful for us to separate ourselves some degree from the technology so we can see the essence of what we are outside of that. But we're so encompassed by so many layers and so many ways that we're connected in technology that I think it's one of the things that when I was reading what you were put together in your dissertation, that was one of the things that struck me.
Yeah, and I know I have a friend who's bricking his phone right now, which means he's just making it into a dumb phone, so all it can do is call and text basically, because he's just like, yeah, I'm way too addicted to my phone. So yeah, it's that same idea.
Yeah, we'll
So
get to that in a little bit too when we get to. I want to talk about that dynamic of what was it of not enhancement and reduction that you talk about. Okay, so there's the techno system. Now are there? I think if I'm correct, there were a couple other features of non-neutrality that he mentions. What are a couple? What's the second one here?
yeah, the second one's unreliable trajectories. So like I was saying technology sort of gives a trajectory to the development of culture and sort of your life. But it has no, so he's really big on unreliable or unintended consequences is how he'd say it. So you sort of make something and then it does its own thing, and now there's an unintended consequence that you couldn't have seen. Um, so yeah, I mean he uses like birth control as an example, right? Of just like we invented this thing and now everyone is expected to use it. It's not something that we thought that that's would be the end when we sort of invented it. But then it just sort of keeps snowballing into other technologies in relation to having kids, basically, right? So like there's some sort of trajectory that we might not have seen when we invented birth control in the first place, where we now are. Um, as far as how we see how like the level of responsibility you have as a person who's out, being promiscuous, if that makes sense. So
Well, yeah.
yeah, so like you have to be a responsible individual if you're going to go do that.
Right.
And the way that you are responsible is by using these technologies. And it's not something that you should just sort of leave up to chance or God, which is what we would have thought in previous times, right? Like, well, God gives you the child when he gives you the child.
Right.
Now it's like, well, you can keep yourself from getting a child. So you should, because the technology is there to use, which is
Well,
probably also, yeah, go ahead, Jim.
I see some interesting steps there. One of the words that comes to mind is this idea of control, and that maybe is an unintended consequence that we have to deal with, is that we have, quote, more abilities. And so one of the things we can control. And so you're using, having birth control is one example for us to be thinking about that. But that's an unfortunate that it's going in that direction. And so, you use some other things that you develop in there. I thought that this idea I think it was in the same section where there was 3 options if you have a problem pregnancy, that either you're going to have C-section, or the mother's going to die, or you actually cut part of the pelvis to try and allow more room for the baby to come out if it's in a problematic birth scenario. And they came up with this idea of a saw, which was the precursor for the chainsaw that you had discussed. And I thought it was interesting that here was a technology that was being developed. And from an engineering and computer science point of view, the term that comes to mind is this design pattern, and how you could use it for one application, and a serendipity, you could start applying these other areas. And so that's what typically happens in technology. So you see one example of something, maybe the technology itself is not good or bad, which is maybe a different word than what you were using, which is a good thing. But you can see how it's going to be used. And so we're going to try and have control, or we're going to be trying to focus on the betterment of mankind. But there's going to be this rainbow of possibilities that start to come up that you have to be dealing with.
Yeah, and I think the reason why that happens is you could conceive of an idea and not actually have the most fitting end for the thing you're inventing, right? And I think a chainsaw is a great example of that, because we invented it to do one thing, but a more fitting end is probably to cut down trees rather than use it on a human, right? Like if I think
in a medical procedure.
Right.
I don't
right,
want
right.
to think like the Saw movies or something.
No. Yeah. No, I'm just saying, like,
Just because we didn't clarify that piece of the art where you show
yeah,
that the original intent of this mini saw, that eventually the design plan went on to become the chainsaw that loggers use. It was to cut a very small bone, right? To
a
allow
joint.
for a problem pregnancy to occur, right? It was to help save a baby's life.
Well, and the mother, because at the time that it was invented, C-sections were very, very dangerous.
Right. Right. But then
Um,
that little design plan went on to have all these other applications as it got modified,
right, but what I'm thinking is it may be that the technology itself was more fitting to not use on a human and rather a tree. Like that the more fitting end, and that's why it went that direction.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
If
So
that
the unintended part of that.
Well,
is
there's
actually,
more trees that need to be trimmed and probably problem pregnancies, and plus there's other layers of thinking about that as well. Well, that's maybe one way I'm hearing what you're saying, Emily.
yeah,
So
because I think,
yeah,
yeah,
go ahead.
go ahead, Tom. Well,
Well,
I was just going to
I'm
say,
just thinking with the non-neutrality part. Maybe we need to clarify this for people listening. The technology is non-neutral in that it starts to use the user, as you said. It
yeah,
affects the user as much as the user sort of has called the technology into existence. But
yeah.
whether or not how it affects us, whether it affects us in a good way or a morally good way or a morally bad way, that we really don't know, right? I mean, it is still neutral in that sense. It's not that technology, as it affects us, will always have a detrimental effect. If it did, maybe we would never make them. We would, or a morally good effect. In that sense, maybe it's still neutral, right? But it's not neutral in the sense of it will have an effect one way or the other. Is that right in the way I'm saying that, or?
I mean, you can see it that way. I tend to think that the majority of what we've invented has been negative to us. So I'm not sure morally, probably, yeah. But it's not like I'd have to stop and try to find examples, and I'm not sure I could, come up with one at the moment. But yeah, I tend to think that the sort of moral impact has been mostly negative. I don't think, and I don't think that you can know that when you invent a thing, that like what the impact is going to be. I think that you can look at it and try to figure it out, but I'm not sure you can always figure out exactly what type of impact it's going to have. But yeah, I mean, I don't. Yeah,
Well,
I just think you
I'm
can't.
thinking, maybe sometimes you like if you think like everybody saw Oppenheimer last year. Okay, so I mean, the technology there um was you'd say maybe the intent uh was to have a weapon of mass destruction, right? So there you would know in advance, based on the intentions of the designers and stuff, that it was morally well. I mean, other than getting into questions like just war theory or anything, but maybe you have a better sense of something like in the pursuit of an atom bomb or a hydrogen bomb.
Well, I think though it's helpful to note that I'm not even I'm not even convinced that the intent to blow something up is actually the problematic aspect of it. I think it's more problematic that when they split the atom, they didn't know what they were going to do, right? They didn't know the effect that splitting an atom would have on the
Yeah.
cosmos itself, right? And they did it anyway. And I think that's where the problem is that we have scientific curiosity that we can't rein in anymore. We just want to know like, there's this curiosity, what happens if I split an atom? Well, we don't know. And based on our metaphysic, we might actually completely unravel the entirety of the cosmos. But we should do it anyway just to find out what it does because we need the bomb.
Well, that's
Like,
the myth of Pandora's box in a nut, right? Isn't it that basically that, or the old saying, curiosity kills the cat? And I agree with you. I feel it's an unstoppable feature of human nature. It's like an unstoppable force of human nature. Just that need to. I was just rereading Abolition of Man after I read this. I reread Abolition of Man, and he basically says, if I'm reading the third chapter, Abolition, correctly, even if we had no intellectual reason to do something, we would just do it because we want to, right? There's a more basic drive. But okay,
Yeah,
so
but
yeah,
I'm not convinced that's always been the case. I
okay.
think that might actually be an effect of technology itself. But
I would
The
argue
technology,
maybe there,
yeah, okay.
there is some degree of ignorance on this part. This is where I think perhaps what part of what you're trying to get at, Emily, is the ethics associated with this, that didn't even occur. I know it's a different field, but AI, it's very strongly they're having to think about ethics from the very beginning of it. But with some of these transformative technologies, that you'd have an issue where you'd really have these kind of consequences. Maybe that's a small percentage of technology, at least that you could forecast the possibility of what would come out. The creation of the internet, I don't know if you'd call it a tool or technology, the printing press. I could just think about, any number of things that are out there. Some of those are they have really amazing things that come out of it, but maybe it's not that severe as the atomic bomb.
yeah, I mean, that is a question of like how how far in advance you can tell your technology that you're inventing is going to have an impact. Like what is it going to be a smaller impact or is it going to be a larger impact?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not sure you could figure like in advance, I'm not sure how much of that you could know. But
Yeah.
yeah.
That can be kind of a challenge. I've mostly been in the scene of being a technology developer with some of my background in industry, and so space technology and stuff like that. You're trying to create a better sensor, something that could last and do a mission a little bit longer, a little bit better. And so technology is a key enabler for that. But then you have the secondary effects, and like some of the early justifications for NASA missions was it going to be you establish the technology and then it's going to be commercialized and go cross into other serendipitous areas that it would go out. And so they would actually encourage that idea of having it go like wildfire and other things. But I think what you're saying is there maybe how much of an ethical perspective was not considered in the midst of those things happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And how much you can actually predict, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But you should at least try to figure it out prior to inventing.
Mm-hmm.
So, and
So,
Emily, back to my other point. So you would also be arguing that that drive to invent, that curiosity, that natural curiosity, that the technology that we invent sort of exaggerates maybe that natural curiosity so that it gets us in a sort of a more rapid cycle of wanting
yeah.
more and more
Yeah.
technology, right? Something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not convinced that the curiosity itself is not given by the technology. So I don't know that curiosity is itself natural. I think it's possible that it's the effect of technology proliferating itself.
Well, I mean, I don't know how much of a historical analysis you did in the dissertation. I mean, how far back then are we going to go with this idea of technology working on us and shaping us in that sort of way? I mean, from the beginning, or I mean, isn't there just a natural curiosity of man to know about the world he's living in and develop? I mean, how far back would
I
the technology is exaggerating curiosity or causing it?
Yeah, I would go back to roughly Francis Bacon. So
Okay.
like in that time when so this is what Ihde would say would be like um technoscience is the label that he gives it. So when technology sort of permeated science and then started driving science, like the two of them merged together and now technology drives science.
Well,
So
and Lewis relates Bacon to sort of the magician. Like he mentions
yeah,
Bacon in the same breath that he relates science to magic, to the new magician being the modern scientist. So that's
yeah,
interesting.
Or maybe that supports what you were trying to make a distinction between a tool and technology, Because well, in one way, I could argue that the wheel is an example of technology, but maybe what you would argue that's more in the area of a tool, because a wheel can't be translated into as many things as a technological idea. The internet, where it just becomes a fabric where so many things can write over it, and they're just the plethora of things that have developed as a result of that. So
Yeah, I think, I would consider a wheel to be a tool. Even like the rubber wheels, like the really good wheels we have on cars, I think would still be just considered a tool, because it's not really changing sort of what the tool, like what the wheel does, right? It still goes on a cart, a car, whatever, to make it go forward. So it hasn't changed really in its functionality. It's just
mhm.
better at the functionality, but the functionality of it hasn't changed. So I could be persuaded that, current wheels on cars or on bikes are still a tool, because they're just the same. They haven't changed enough from a past tool, or a past wheel, to be considered something other than a tool. I could be argued into that position. So yeah.
No, that's interesting. That's interesting. No, I mean, yeah. So we'd be placed in the kind of technology that you're talking about in the dissertation, and that Ihde's talking about as well. We're talking about sort of the technology that starts to develop around the time of the early modern period, the scientific revolution, and then the industrial revolution.
That would be my distinction. ID doesn't have that distinction.
Okay.
So that's why I said it's a research interest for me, because it's not something that he would have said. It's kind of a contentious view to hold at the moment. So I tend to think it's correct to have that distinction in place, but not everyone would agree with me. So yeah, I just want to make clear that's not something ID would agree with or say.
Okay. Okay, but one of the things he does say, if I read your paper correctly, is that, I mean, I think he made the distinction between what comes, it's kind of like a chicken and egg. What comes first then? Is it the theoretical science, or is it the technology? So this is this is kind of another nested question in there, is, do we develop technologies that then drive, I guess, our more theoretical science, or is it the theoretical sciences that sort of develop the technologies? And I think if I'm wrong in saying that, and I think what you say, Ihde says, is we make the technologies, right? The concrete technologies kind of come first. And what we'd say that then shapes how we're going to do science, right? Is that the idea?
Yeah. Yeah, that would be his view, is that the technology or science is technologically embodied, I think is how we would say it. So his example would be Galileo, right? So Galileo wouldn't have had the discoveries that he had without the telescope. So the telescope gave him the ability to perceive in a different way. And when his perceptions changed through the telescope, he then came up with other theories. So he wouldn't have had those theories without the telescope. So the theoretical follows the technological, in his view.
Maybe I'll just put in a point or two. That's a good point that I hadn't thought about, but trying to think, is it sort of like a chicken and the egg point of view? And my engineering training and industry experience, what I would argue is that science comes first and then technology follows. That what technology does is it look what is in science, and then you actually figure out how you can apply that, how you can exploit the phenomenology to create something that actually going to do a purpose that's going to be helpful. Maybe that gets back to this point of view where you have a technology developer versus a technology consumer. And there isn't completely a separation between those. There's some overlap. And so, but you think of an analogy like priming the pump, maybe that's what you're getting at. So maybe technology, science comes first, but technology then seeds it. So then you can go back and do science. And then the science can see that, well, wow, I get more insight into the cosmos. And so you're going to then go more to technology, and it's going to iterate back and forth, and maybe making that cycle that couldn't have been done if you hadn't put those things together. So from a modern perspective, maybe it would be saying that technology would come first, but I'm probably still biased with my engineering background to tend to think that science would be the first one of those things. But since you kind of gave a construct for where you saw there was a change, and so when we went from tools to technology, maybe if you start to put that in the mix, it would make more sense to that construct that you're arguing for.
Yeah, I know there's another example he gives, and I can't think of it right now. But the idea that like there was a scientist that put a feather in a vacuum,
Mhm.
and I can't, do you remember who that is?
I don't remember who it is, but I also know that it was also demonstrated on the moon, and that's the one I had a more recent experience with. They had a rock and a feather, and they dropped it on the moon because there was no atmosphere, and they fell and hit the ground at the same time. I presume that's what you're referring to, is the fact that you had a feather in a vacuum, it would fall down according to the gravity, just as any other object would go. 9.8 meters per second squared is it's just going to accelerate towards the center of the earth.
It it was more, I think the point was that it disproved ether, but I'm not 100% on that. So it was one of the things that they used to disprove the theory of ether within the air. And I can't remember now. Um, I would have to go back and look it up. But I do remember he gave two examples. One is Galileo with the telescope, and then the other is, I can't remember. It starts with a B, Boyle. I
Okay.
I
Oh,
I don't
Robert
remember
Boyle.
what Boyle's experiment was, but I do know that that's the second one of the other examples he gives.
Mhm.
But how is that technology driving the science? I could see okay, so there was something that Boyle had, some instrument that he had,
As
right?
I recall, Boyle dealt a lot with gases, and so to be able to create a vacuum, to even have that experiment,
He
would
needed
be
the tool.
something that would have been novel. Maybe that might be an example that you're trying to get at.
It might have been, and like I said, I'm not 100% sure what the experiment was, or I just know that he had two examples, and one of them was the telescope, and the other
I mean,
was
it's just interesting, and I don't want to extrapolate too much from this idea of technology being first and that driving science. I'd want to have, certainly there's an interplay there. Maybe it's a both and. One isn't necessarily first. It's hard to maybe it's hard to discern when it's the technology leading to a new discovery or a theoretical discovery that allows us to develop a certain technology. But because, I mean, I think of the whole history of the 19th century, and always looking for the substructure to all of reality. It's for Marx is economics or class struggle. And, for Schopenhauer, it was, the will and everything. And, I wouldn't want to like say it's there is a sense that man is homo faber, man, the maker of things, but it's just technology is just the root cause of all of, you know, uh, everything that human beings do and all of our endeavors and projects and enterprises. But maybe he's probably not going that far, but it started to feel that way a little bit to me. If technology is the cause of scientific discovery, but I don't know, maybe he's not saying that strongly.
well, he does call it techno science, so science does play a role too. So he wouldn't say that science plays no role. He would just say the technology gives the scientists the imagination to make the discoveries or something like that.
Okay. Well, let's move into this. I want to move into this final section here,
Okay.
final section of this small section of your dissertation. That's probably I think most relevant, and also a little to me the most frightening aspect of what he's saying about technology here in this the non-neutrality part of it is how the technology actually can affect us, affect the user in various ways. So how it sort of shapes our experiences. So, I mean, why don't you just give us a rundown on like what are some of the main dangers, I think, that of how technology, its non-neutrality, the fact that it is non-neutral sort of alters us to the point of where it's almost it's changing us, or it's even controlling us in a sense.
Yeah, so he says basically that it while you're using it, it sort of amplifies some things about the world and reduces others, which then moves into it can cause you to rely on certain senses that you have, so like sight rather than smell or something like that. So you start to rely on a different sense more so than you would have the others, which then makes you slowly it sort of reduces the importance of the sense that's being slowly pushed into the background. So one of the interesting examples he gives is like within the medical world, you use MRIs, X-rays, and then you get a visual of what's going on in the body. And he said, well, we could have had sound, right? Which even like a sonogram or something like that, you're still getting a visual representation of what the sound is finding within your body. And he said, well, we could have had it represented through different pitches being given off, right? There's no reason why we had to have it a visual representation. But once you have the visual representation, you now prize the visual over the other senses to the point that you then slowly don't rely on the other senses as much as you do the physical or the visual.
I might also argue along with that you're using whatever the technology is telling you as a diagnosis, that's what you're going with. Maybe minimizing the engagement with that individual to find out what's going on. And there may be some key pieces just because you're seeing this, but you need to understand what is the situation that's going on with this individual. And so it's once again, it's a very much a reliance upon technology. You trust what its sensors are saying, even more than trusting your own senses.
Yeah, that's a great point too, because another example he gives is blood pressure, right? You can feel, or cholesterol levels, right? You feel completely fine, but your numbers are off. So now you're told, well, you have high cholesterol and you've got to worry about these things and don't eat these foods and all of this stuff. Whereas before you just went with, well, how do I feel?
Mm-hmm.
And it was self-reporting, whereas you don't self-report anymore. It's more based on the numbers that are given that are, again, a visual representation of what's going on in your body.
Well, Emily, was this in your paper? It was. I think you mentioned COVID, right?
Did I?
I
Was
thought
this the section I mentioned COVID in?
I
But
think
that's a great example if I didn't.
it's a good example or not?
No, that's a great example. You're
No, I want to say I read it somewhere today. I think it was today
it might have
reading through the paper. I thought it was in here about because somebody could be asymptomatic and be like, I'm great, but then you're told, oh, but you take the test, you have COVID-19, right? And then all of a sudden your life, in knowing about these microscopic details that the technology allows us, right? We have to change our whole pattern of behavior.
yeah.
Or
Yeah,
we're told we have to at least
yeah.
change
Yeah.
our whole
Well,
pattern.
so that's actually a really interesting point too, is I wrote half of this during the pandemic. So talk about like living your research. It was terrible because it was like I had to Zoom with everybody. Like I couldn't be with them physically, right? But yeah, I think that's in one of my footnotes somewhere. I know I mentioned in a footnote. So if you check there, you might find it. Because I don't know that I put it in the main body because I wrote this particular section of it prior to the pandemic. And then before submitting, I was like, well, this massive thing just happened in the world. And so it probably should be referenced somewhere. So I threw it into some footnotes because it would have taken too much to like rewrite certain sections. But I was like, it needs to be addressed in the footnotes that like this is a perfect example. You have to test even though you're asymptomatic and the test tells you whether you're sick or not. It doesn't matter how you feel. It doesn't matter if like and people that I've seen stuff where people feel like they have a cold, they test, it comes back positive, and then they freak out that they might die because it's COVID. And it's like, well, do you feel like you're going to die right now? Probably. I mean, it feels like you've had this for like 5 days now, right? And it feels like a normal cold, or maybe a little bit weirder than a cold. But you know what I'm saying? So like rather than going with how the symptoms feel in the moment, they're going with, oh, it's this particular thing that I just tested positive for. Or again, if you're asymptomatic and you test positive, like you said, now you have to change, all your behaviors. You have to stay home, you have to isolate and all of that stuff.
Or you're told you have to.
One thing
You have to
wanted to
go
bring
so-
up that's
Yeah.
with you talking about that, since you mentioned Zoom, one of the faculty members on my dissertation committee, he talked about creating an online community. And sometimes that can create community in situations where otherwise wouldn't really happen. And I think COVID is an example of where that happened. And so maybe it's one example where technology, maybe it's actually has a helpful area. It almost sounds contradictory where the technology is helping us to get more human. This technology in certain ways is helping us to not get into technology. I don't know if that makes any sense, the dichotomy that maybe shows up a little bit there.
Yeah, the only pushback that I would give is I'm not sure governments could have managed to get people to completely isolate the way they did without the technology.
Yeah, I was trying to just think more of the technology piece rather than focus so much on COVID in that situation, because it's one of those things where there's so many, you almost have to, the technical term is principal component analysis for geeks like our engineers. So like think about one thing and forget about all the other things. And I was just trying to think about the virtual connection for a moment. But but I do agree what you mentioned that things like Zoom really made the experience of COVID a lot more manageable. My wife and I were able to create community in ways that we could be compliant, but still have some level of connection with others.
So
Yeah,
I think the danger though then is if we get reliant on the Zoom, right, then do we
Yeah.
become shaped or changed in such a way where actual embodied contact. There was an old science fiction novel by E.M. Forster called The Machine Stops. He wrote it in 1919. He was already sort of foreseeing this stuff, where we lose maybe even the desire, right, for embodied contact. And then you got to think of like what ramifications that might have.
That was a downside of COVID, and I know for myself, going back to church face to face, there was some intangibles that I hadn't really thought about. Just there was a lot easier to get into worship. It was a lot just to have that shaking somebody's hand, have that physical presence with other folks. There is a dimension that you can't capture with technology. So I do agree that there are dimensions that are hard, well, really impossible to match with technology. But I just wanted to lay that out there. One other thing I was curious about, you have this section on technology's ability to transform experience. And one of the things I was thinking about is media is an example that we use to kind of transform our experience. You think of a good movie or something like that. I mean, that's kind of a context that's very common in our society. Back in the time of Christ, it was an oral tradition that they had to depend on. Everybody was together and they were interacting with the story. Well, that's not really quite the case. And I was wondering if you had an impression about that.
about like the impacts of media, like film,
Yeah,
or
so is media, would you consider that technology? There's a lot of technology that goes into movie making. And so was that another way? Is the technology embodied in an example of movie making that we're trying to transform our experience through technology?
yeah, I mean, I would think so. Yeah, that it is an instance of technology. So I think it would be like something like technology applied to myth making or something like that.
Mhm.
Where I mean I will say that I enjoy films that use practical what's it called? Not CGI, basically.
Yeah.
Right. So I don't enjoy films that are made with green screens. I don't find them
Mhm.
to be at all enjoyable or appealing. I mean,
Yeah.
the last one I watched was Endgame, and after
Yeah.
that I was just like I'm done with the uh largeness of this to the point that it's not enjoyable anymore. At least for me. I know not everybody feels that way about it.
I feel the same.
But
We're on the same
yeah,
page. Sure.
yeah, okay, okay. But yeah, I would say roughly film is I would consider it a technology, yeah.
Well, some of these themes might be worth, we'll have another conversation to get into those, because I don't think we're going to do justice with them in just a few minutes here. But maybe that's one of those areas, because I know you talked about the implications that you wanted to draw that together, and we really haven't had a chance to get into that either.
The implications of like which piece are you
Um,
thinking?
well, in this part of your dissertation, you have it's called section 3.5, implication technology
Hmm.
influences an individual. And just to be thinking through that, I know we've been kind of touching on that, but I think there's probably even more, and then start to draw out the ethical points that maybe we want to think about. But that's just my perspective. There might be more for us to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, but there's a lot there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot here. I mean, I had in my notes here too. You talk about, I mean, in this section on amplification and reduction, like that we were touching on with the, amplifying the visual to the reduction of others of our senses or our embodied experiences, and you mentioned the reduction of our memory, our capacity to remember, right? Which I think is obviously going to be affected by artificial intelligence. I mean,
Well, it already is by your
yeah,
smartphone.
Yeah.
right. I mean, I just look stuff up instead of remembering. It's, I tend to be somebody who's has a good memory, and I'm thinking to myself, and my oldest son has an excellent memory, and I'm like, how do I be careful to not like diminish sort of these natural gifts, that God has given me, and it seems to be passed on to my son in virtue of just having just the easiness of looking up information, in a flash, right?
Yeah.
And then also you even talked about the sort of skepticism about an external world. Sort of like, you know, I mean, I don't know, maybe go into that one a little bit. That was kind of interesting because that brings up the old epistemic problem of modernity, right? That, sort of Descartes, starts that ball rolling, and then, we've had evil demons and brains in a vat thought experiments for centuries now. But
Yeah, don't forget the Matrix. That was an entirely
yeah, in the
new thing too.
Matrix. So, but I mean, what was that seemed to be one of the implications of this amplification of, I think it was the amplification of the visual.
Yeah, so if you so God gave us five senses for a reason, right? Um, and if you amplify one over the other ones and then diminish the other ones, it becomes, I mean, if you were to tell somebody who's never heard any philosophy, right, out in, working a field or something, hey, we think the external world might not exist because we kind of can't prove it because of the richness of the experience of the world that they have through their five senses, they're going to think you're crazy. But if you reduce the importance of certain senses and you only prize the visual, then it's easier to get you to start believing, well, maybe the external world doesn't exist. Because you can do things like have a red light, right, with a piece of white paper and convince the person it's a red piece of paper. And then you turn the light off and, oh my goodness, it's white. And now I like my
You only,
senses deceived me,
yeah,
right? Like
you
it's
only have to
easier.
cast doubt on the reliability of one sense,
Exactly.
not a
Exactly.
five or maybe
Yeah.
six.
And it
Yeah,
is pretty easy to sort of cast or it's not as it's pretty easy to sort of give people visual sort of games, right? Where you manipulate the way that they see something. That's not that hard. Like a pencil in a glass of water is another really good example of like, oh my goodness, it's bent. Wait, no, it's not bent. Oh no, now what do I do with the world? Like I can't argue
I've
that the
seen a
pencil.
lot of those visual trick things put up on by skeptics, by atheists, like, oh, but see, you looked at this and you I don't know, you saw the duck instead of the bunny or whatever it may be, or
Right.
and they'll use that idea that if I can show that your visual experiences are unreliable, then that should cast doubt on all of your experience more generally. And then you should be a skeptic, especially about, metaphysical things and
Right.
religious things. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So I know Jim's got to go soon. And Jim, just if you have to jump off, I do want to finish up though with these 5 types. And I think we've touched on them already, but let's go through these 5 types of relationships. I think this was critical, and this was the point I think you wanted to talk about the most. These 5 types of relationships between the user and technology, and maybe we can give a few examples, and hopefully that will sort of round off the discussion here. But yeah, we'll probably have to do another one at some point. But do you want to
Okay.
walk us through the 5 types of relationships between the user and technology?
Yeah, sure. I'm just really quick. Are you good, Jim?
Well, I don't have much time. I might be able to spend about 5 or 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay, cool. All right. Well then, I'll just try to, encapsulate them all pretty quick. So, yeah, so there's an embodiment relation. So that's where you enter into the technology and sort of experience the world through the technology itself. So an example that he gives is driving a car. So you embody the car, right? You feel the road through the car. You roughly know where the car is in space. When you're parking, you roughly know where the lines are without having to look at them, right? And sort of experience the world through the car. And you kind of expand your own bodily sort of limitations through the car, if that makes sense. So that's roughly an embodiment relation. There's a hermeneutic relation, and that's where the technology sort of stands between you and the world, and it interprets the world past itself between you and it, or between you and the world. So it stands in between the two of you. So an example of this would be like a pilot's cockpit panel, right? So you look at the panel to know what's happening within the plane. And if it's set up well, it's a pretty intuitive panel, right? So you can kind of look at it and know what's happening without having to spend too much time reading it. So you read hermeneutic relations. The next one would be an alterity relation. So that means you see it as other than you. So Ihde uses a top, and like a spinning top as an example. So you animate the top, and then once it's spinning, you step back and it keeps going. So it's other than you. So it's out there in the world as something else that's not you. The fourth one is a background relation. So this is something that once made visible, it then fades into the background. So something like the
refrigerator.
The refrigerator, yeah, refrigerator noises or furnace noises, where if you want to, you can pull them from the background into the foreground and sort of pay attention to them and attend to them. But if you don't do that, they just sort of fade, and you don't recognize them anymore. And the last one is a horizontal relation, and this one is one that it's really similar to an embodiment relation, but it's something that you can't remove from your body once it's there. So it's like a hip replacement, or like a filling. That's another one. You can kind of pull the filling back into the foreground if you run your tooth over it, and you can tell this tooth feels sort of glossy or smoother than the other teeth if you have a good dentist, right? If you have a bad one, it's like, oh, this is really rough.
I
And
have
then
the best dentist in Orange County, by the way. And
all right, cool.
Well,
Shout out to the best
I
dentist
should
ever.
mention Dr. Bay's name, but he's awesome. And I have a lot of teeth issues. He's the best.
But yeah, so you can kind of see how that works, where it fades in onto or it doesn't fade into the background, but it becomes part of the horizon, which within phenomenology, the horizon is as far as you can see, right? And so it's something that you can't see past. And so it's always there, out sort of in the world, and something that you're always seeing, if that makes sense. So like you can't remove yourself from the relation once it's there. And it's kind of hard to remember that it's there, because it's just become so much a part of you. So it's different from an embodiment relation, but it's kind of similar.
And I tell you what I think we want to do. We'll wrap it up for now. I think we want to do a part 2 on these 5 relationships. That is super interesting to think of examples in our daily lives of these 5 different types of technologies, ones that we're in, ones that are in us, literally, ones that give us information about the world. So I think we want to do a whole separate podcast on that and dig a little deeper into those. But this has been great. I mean,
yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Just really quick.
Yeah.
The reason why they're important is once you know what type of relation you're standing in towards the technology, it will tell you what kind of desires that technology is going to give you. So it will help you figure out how it's influencing you.
Right. And so that's what I want to sort of be maybe the goal of the next time we meet, or, part 2 of this. Next time we meet, we're not in the same room together. This is all mediated through a screen, through technology.
Yes, the irony has not been lost on me.
Because the idea, I think, one application here for us is to think about, to become more and more aware of the relationships we stand in with our technologies, right? So that we can be more resilient or resistant to how they might be shaping us, right? Or
Yeah.
at least aware of it. Maybe it's in a way, but maybe it's not. And if we start to discern how technology is shaping us in a negative way or ungodly way, or unrighteous way, that would be, I think that's the kind of work we need to be. That's kind of theological work that needs to be done, in the very practical sense, day-to-day living, right?
Yeah.
I look forward to that conversation. That'd be good.
Yeah. So Emily, this has been a great intro to this topic. Again, we will have a part 2 of this, of course. And I just want to thanks again, and thanks Jim for chiming in as well. And I'm definitely looking forward to the next piece of this. This will be good. Yeah.
Me too.
All right. Well, take care, guys. God bless.
All
Good
right,
job.
guys. Have a good one. Okay, bye.